Hi guys. So I know I haven't been doing much uploading as lately. I haven't done much content, new content on narcissism or on anything else. And that's because I've been pretty busy with work and a couple projects that I'm currently working on and a book that I'm putting together. So those activities had me preoccupied for quite a while. However, I'm currently on vacation from work, so that means I have a lot more time on my hands to put out new content. So, yay! The topic today would again be narcissism, and it was inspired by a case that I've been following for the past few days, actually, for the past week or so. A case that I found particularly intriguing. I don't know how many of you are familiar with a Lifetime movie entitled, well, it's actually a two-part made-for-TV movie that aired on Lifetime many, many years ago in the early 1990s. The first one was called Betty Broderick, A Woman Scorned, and the second one was called Her Final Fury. I don't know how many of you know that movie or are familiar with it, but it was actually inspired by true events, and it was based on the Broderick versus Broderick case that took place from 1983, I believe, or is it 1985? From 1985 to 1989. That's how long the divorce procedure and the entire divorce itself took to come to an end. But anyhow, this movie I found particularly intriguing. Now, naturally, I have a sort of a fondness for looking at true crime stories. No, I'm not crazy and I'm not sick or anything like that, but I just unsolved mysteries and true crime programming and stuff like that. I like to watch those things as a hobby. Law and Order is one of my favorite TV shows ever, so go figure. But as I was saying, this movie made me actually go, this two-part film made me actually go and look up the real Betty Broderick and look up the case, the Broderick versus Broderick divorce, and Dan Broderick and Linda Kalkina and all the people who were involved. And had I not gone and done my own research about Betty Broderick and about the entire thing, I think I too would have been among the people who said, oh, you know, Betty Broderick, she's this crazy, evil woman and she deserves to be kept behind bars for the rest of her life. They should lock her up and throw away the key, etc., etc. But after actually doing a lot of research, extensive research about the case and about what their marriage was like, the marriage between Dan and Betty, I begin to realize that two things people don't mention. They don't mention the fact that Dan was actually your classic textbook narcissist and that Betty was mentally ill. Nobody ever mentions that. Sure, they say that Betty is crazy and that she's evil and that she's a psychopath. I think there was even a defense attorney, sorry, not a defense attorney, a prosecution attorney who claimed that Betty had narcissistic personality disorder. But if you actually look at all the interviews with Betty and you look at the way she talks and you gain some insight into what makes a woman tick, you can see that she is not a narcissist. I do believe, however, that Betty Broderick had borderline personality disorder or has borderline personality disorder, and we all, one thing that people with borderline personality disorder struggle with is regulating their emotions and their reactions and responses to certain things that deeply affect them. And this is exactly what Betty experienced and what she was going through, at least in my opinion. But my bad, I forgot to mention what happened to Dan Broderick for the people who probably do not know. Dan Broderick left Betty Broderick. They were married for 16 years. They got married really young when she was just 21 and he would have been about 23 years old. And they were both very Catholic. They were both staunch Catholics. They had staunch Catholic upbringings and they believed in staying together till death do us part. They literally believed in a married couple keeping that part of their vows or taking that part of their vows very seriously. or more so Betty, because obviously Dan didn't really buy in too much into the till death do us part thing, or he wouldn't have asked her for a divorce. Now, Dan, when he met Betty, was what he would call a doctor almost. That's how he introduced himself to her. He told her he was almost a doctor. And he expressed his desire to her that he wanted to go to medical school and that he wanted to go to law school. So he enrolled in Harvard University and Cornell University, where he majored in law, and he also majored in medicine. And during that time, while he was in school, Betty was the one. She had a degree in early childhood education, I believe, and I think she also majored in English. So I think she double majored in early childhood education and in English. And she would use her degree to go out there and get jobs to support Dan while he was in school, and to be the sole breadwinner for the household. By that time, they would have had about 3 kids, I believe, or 2. I know they had more than 1 child at that time, and Betty was working her finger to the bone because she believed in Dan's vision, and she believed that if she supported this man and she stood by him, that he would get to achieve the greatness that he wanted to achieve. And eventually, Dan achieved greatness. He opened up his own practice. He made a lot of money. He was clocking $1 million a year. They joined country clubs. They bought a big house in San Diego. They had a pretty good life, and their children attended prep school, so they had a really good life. And then in 1983, Dan hired a secretary whom he said was a paralegal and his assistant. Even though she knew nothing about law, she never went to law school, she never even went to college, and she could not type. So there really wasn't much she could do in terms of office duty. She was more or less just an office frill for Dan, decoration. So she was being paid just to decorate Dan's office, more or less. And what eventually happened was that Dan started to have an affair with this young girl who was Linda Colkina, and she was just 22 years old at the time. And Betty suspected, as most women would in that situation, she suspected that her husband was cheating on her, that he was having an affair with this younger woman. And for many, many years, he denied it. And because of the denial, the constant denial, and what Betty felt was gaslighting, she began to do erratic things. She would light his clothes afire. She would pick frequent arguments with him. Things that your average person who doesn't suffer from BPD and doesn't have mental illness would probably think twice about doing, Betty did, because of the fact that she had borderline personality disorder. And Dan's behavior wasn't helping. What Dan would do is that he would tell her she was ugly, and that she was boring, and that she was fat, and that she was old, and that she was stupid, and that was why their marriage was falling apart. So he tried to make her feel that everything was wrong with her, and that is why he wanted out of the marriage. There was one time he even said, during a divorce hearing, that when he was asked when did the marriage start coming apart and when did he first think about divorce, he said that he started to think about divorce from the day they got married. And that was an awful, awful thing. Betty just burst into tears because that was an awful, awful thing for him to say to the mother of his children. But anyhow, what eventually happened was that Dan got the divorce in 1985. He finally got the divorce that he wanted from Betty. And she was cheated out of a lot of alimony. She was greatly bullied by all of his legal buddies because he was a very, very powerful person in the law field and in the field of medicine, and he used all his connections and all of his strengths to make sure that Betty walked away with almost nothing from the divorce. And added to that, Linda Colkina would badmouth Betty to everyone she knew. everyone who knew Betty and say that she was crazy and etc. etc. She even, as a matter of fact, there was even a time that Betty got a picture in the mail of Dan and Linda together. And the inscription on the picture said, "Eat your heart out, bitch." And then another time, she sent an advertisement for, what was it, wrinkle cream or weight loss products or something like that to Betty. And this was just to reinforce the idea that Dan had been putting into Betty's head all these years, that she was fat and ugly and dumb and stupid, etc. etc. So, what eventually happened was that Betty, because of the fact that she had untreated borderline personality disorder, she wasn't in any kind of therapy or anything like that, Betty came unhinged. And Betty decided that she would, well, I don't know if she decided, maybe it was a spur of the moment thing, but she decided to kill Dan and his wife. And again, I say maybe she didn't actually decide to do it, because people with BPD don't really premeditate things. They just go with the feeling that they get in the moment because of the fact that they're unable to regulate their emotions. So I believe that's what happened to Betty. And in 1989, November 1989, Betty took a key that she had taken from her daughter Lee's purse that would have enabled her to access Dan and Linda's house, and she entered Dan and Linda's house in the wee hours of the morning. I think it was 5 a.m. and she fired 5 bullets at them. And what she said later on, when she was being interviewed and she was asked about the moment she pulled the trigger, she would often say that she doesn't remember the details of it, that it's as if she wasn't there. It was like an outer body experience. It's like she was watching it happen to somebody else. Like she was just a bystander and she saw this thing happening. So she can't really give details because it was such a shock to her even. She said that she was startled. She fired the gun. She couldn't remember how many times it was fired, but the long and short of it is that Linda got 2 bullets, one to the head and one to the chest, and she died instantly, and Dan got 1 to the chest, and it would have taken him about 30 minutes to die. So here we had a really messy divorce that turned into a really messy situation. It turned into murder. It became murderous, and Dan and Linda were now dead, and Betty was facing prison.